Professor Victor Kramer from Georgia State University, and his title is A Rule for Beginners, Benedict, Gandhi, Thomas Merton, and Martin Luther King, Jr. Dr. Kramer.
Thank you. I have a title, an epigraph, a summary, and 4 parts, plus the Benedictine handbook with a biography of Thomas Merton, and I'm not going to read that paragraph, but I simply read one sentence about Merton. Towards the end of his life, he became extremely interested in monastic interfaith dialogue, and I would add ecumenism. The paper is called A Rule for Beginners, Benedict, Gandhi, Merton, and King, and the subtitle is A Monastic Lens for Reading America's Civil Rights Movement. The epigraph is the first sentence of Benedict's 1,500-year-old rule: listen, child of God, to the guidance of your teacher. My summary includes 4 steps. First, parallels are observed between the ideals of Benedictine life and the basic goals of the civil rights movement. Second, similarities are shown to fuel Thomas Merton's empathy. Thirdly, Merton's compassion is evident, and like King, he extends his vision to the whole world. And lastly, as a common thread, the necessity of being aware of a wider community becomes paramount. I have brought along a sheet about Merton's Cistercian branch of the Benedictine religious order, and if you're interested, you could have one of these sheets, plus a quote from Aelred of Rievaulx, who was writing in the 12th century, 600 years after Benedict. Part 1, parallels. I do not intend to turn Martin King into a monastic abbot, but the more I think about this topic, the clearer are parallels between Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism, and Saint Martin. The spirit of a Benedictine life informs King's work in all of Merton's social concerns, especially Merton's examination of race questions. The presentation assumes that enduring qualities of Benedict's rule have greatly influenced our Western sense of community, and for Merton, his personal vowed life became a tool for reading the 1960s. His way of life attuned him to his brother monks. As monastics, they lived to perfect individual spiritual goals and also those of their community. Together, all were committed to pray and work. Merton's felt compassion for persons who were denied such solidarity. He also knew that to be a successful leader of committed Christians who were seeking justice, the climate of a shared, positive, collaborative atmosphere was necessary. All involved, the youngest and the most senior, provided input for decision making. Such a shared process builds trust and stability. Merton's interpretation of the civil rights struggle was therefore filtered through his lived knowledge and sustained in charity. He lived 27 years as a monk. He died when he was 53. He was disciplined to appreciate the immediacy and the goodness which was being lived by courageous black and white people in the 60s. 14 years separate the births of Merton and King, yet both experienced hardships of the Great Depression and the mood of post-World War II. Both, as religious leaders, were first reserved, quiet, and introspective. When increasingly called to speak, each sought ways to strengthen community. Merton knew Harlem in the 1930s and considered working there. King knew Auburn Avenue in the 30s and 40s. For both, the church became crucial in the development of private and public conscience. St. Benedict, Gandhi, Merton, King were fundamentally concerned with building just communities. To do so, all 4 took radical steps. 1,500 years ago, as Roman civilization crumbled, Benedict, founder of Western monasticism, stood back, distilled insights from 3 centuries of early Middle Eastern desert monasticism, sustained by faith and in humility. This practice ties together contemplation of God in our lives and good actions in the world. For people living in harmony, Benedict's rule outlines a way of life which endures into the present moment. While this presentation presentation outlines only a few patterns. I am suggesting that Benedict's insights provide basic groundwork for Gandhi, King, Merton, and all of those persons confronted traditional patterns of cultural and religious selfishness as they sought to renew their own communities as well as the society and culture surrounding them. This is, I think, a book-length topic to be researched by someone. I know someone who started working on this project. The rule, 1,500 years old, sets the tone for all Benedictine houses as well as the Cistercian 12th century and Trappist reform, 17th century reforms. Emphasis upon humility, obedience, stability, and becoming Christ-like by working for others is fundamental. Such emphasis helps us understand Merton's concern for all marginalized persons and his admiration of King. Also, both further reinforce their actions by recognizing how Gandhi challenged the assumptions of the West. Both admired Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. Both were concerned about how to act nonviolently. Merton knew well and endorsed Benedict's emphasis upon collaboration. There's a whole book of Merton's on the rule of St. Benedict, and that word collaboration turns up over and over. His genius, King's genius, was to realize that this vision was not just for a minority, but for the dominant culture. This is what Merton emphasizes in his appreciation and endorsements of King. This is clear. King knew how to work and work carefully with others. There's an article in a recent 3-week-old National Catholic Reporter about a Catholic priest in Selma who had been working there for a dozen years, and King found out about him and went and asked for his help. And that was part of the background of what happened in Selma. Part 2, empathy. Without providing great amounts of detail, I will now let Merton do a good bit of the work by mentioning some of his writing which reflects his deep awareness of the struggles of black people from the 1930s to his death in '68. He wrote about Thoreau, Gandhi, James Baldwin. That is also why I'm convinced there's a book-length topic here. This is revealed in the 7 complete journals, 3,500 pages. It's scattered throughout his correspondence. There are now 5 selected volumes and still other books that Merton wrote about peace and war. So my second step asserts that Merton clearly admired in the Afro-American character something grounded in the same ideals of peace which he also sought to live. Therefore, his writing about this subject grew in affirmation. A contemplative stance is fundamental, quite the reverse of what he had analyzed throughout his book, Merton's book, about race in the United States. Merton published a book in '49 called Seeds of Contemplation. He revised it in '62, and he called it New Seeds of Contemplation, and his book about race and violence in America is called Seeds of Destruction, and it grows straight out of the work that civil rights people were doing in the '60s. False assumptions of white liberal societies which sought to manipulate black people, Merton insisted, were wrong. Instead, we must examine both cultures and assess how the needs of both are intertwined. Then one prays, and then one works as community. Merton's knowledge of monastic patterns was based on his conviction that a strong leader, the abbot, made decisions, but all was based on the input from all members. He could see that in King. King, as a charismatic leader, led well, listened well. Merton wrote in 1961, quote, "Life moves on inexorably towards crisis and mystery. Such fact provides opportunity, and in the civil rights struggle, he saw the possibility of complex cultural losses for the whole culture." And he said, Merton said, in letters, in essays, in books, that he, as a cloistered monk, was personally involved. His empathy established a personal connection with suffering. Researchers might study his beautiful poem, The Children of Birmingham. That was published in '63 in a book called Emblems in a Season of Fury. Merton was fundamentally a poet. The collected poems are 1,000 146 pages. His journals often reflect his continuing examination of these questions. To observe the emergence of King necessitated his own need for involvement. Eventually, this would lead to plans for King to arrange for a retreat to take place at the Abbey of Gethsemane, which was to follow Memphis. This was facilitated by people here in Atlanta, John and June Youngblood. One short journal entry, March 11, 61, affirms Merton's compassion. The Negro's struggle for integration is necessary, but they have to face fear and guilt and passivity, and one of the most difficult things is to admit completely in their hearts what they know intellectually, that they are right. There are many journal entries. I edited Journal 4, Turning Toward the World, 1960-63. There's enough data in that journal alone to reinforce what I'm beginning to say here. Many of Merton's journals in the 60s stress his growing awareness of solidarity with all displaced people, with a culture fueled by hatred and separation. In still other entries, he stressed that good persons must not flee from the world. Contemptus mundi will not do. Good persons must utilize their contemplative awareness. It must be balanced with activity. Part 3, involvement. In the faith and action of black people, Merton saw individuals who were striving for perfection, yet they remained humble and dignified. This is what Benedict also insisted upon. There's evidence of this throughout Merton's writings, his vocation of balancing his own temptation to withdraw into seclusion, along with the opposite conviction that the civil rights era was a genuine moment of kairos. He has a whole section in this book, Seeds of Destruction, about kairos. That is the moment when you know it is time to act. This topic is everywhere in books by Merton, as early as 61, a book called Behavior of Titans, which is about man's Promethean attempts to control. Still another book, a text called Raids on the Unspeakable, was published in 66. That book is about the fact that we do not speak about God. Part 4, conclusion. Building community through their focus upon specifics, transportation, voting rights, housing, schooling. It was clear to Merton that civil rights activists, as guided by King, were doing a similar kind of thing as his fellow monastics, extending the kingdom within particular settings. Now, in this last part of the paper, I remind you that building community is of the essence of what Benedict, Gandhi, Merton, King were about. Merton would not despair in this era of faith and violence. That's actually a title of another one of his books. We know that Merton hoped to meet Martin Luther King. He was planning to host that retreat at Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky following Memphis. Merton was devastated when the news came across the radio that King had been murdered. It is significant how he immediately reacted. He was with a friend from England, the Reverend Donald Alchin. Alchin's commented on this and was interviewed and said that Merton, in the automobile, said they should not go back to the monastery. Instead, they drove into Bardstown to be with a black man Merton knew who ran the restaurant. We can see these two men of God, Merton and King. They saw moments of kairos. There are all kinds of other parallels. I was in the lobby downstairs and I saw a photograph of Dorothy Day, and I thought about the correspondence that he, Merton, had done with her. What I'm suggesting is that Western civilization, through the accomplishments of monasticism, absorbed a model grounded in the Benedictine rule and manifested in Merton's wishes. This is a fostering of community. Representative John Lewis tells a powerful story about when he was a child. I heard him give this at a symposium at Emory a few years back. When he, Representative Lewis, was a child, he would go and visit his auntie in the summer, and she lived out in the country and she took care of children. Lewis remembers how when a frightening thunderstorm came, she would gather the children together in her fragile small cabin, tell them not to worry about the lightning, tell them that God was with them and would protect them. Then they would hold hands. Lewis said, "This is the model of the blessed community." This is what we're all learning to do. This is what St. Benedict has been teaching for 1,500 years. Both Thoreau and Gandhi challenged traditional Western society. Now in the same mold come Merton and King, telling us to work together to build community. So in this presentation, we've begun to suggest how Benedict provided a guide for monasticism and how Merton's appreciation of this way of life gave him a useful lens to interpret King and what he and others were doing. By building a sense of community akin to the Benedictine ideal, these peacemakers provide a model for contemplatives, for serious Christians working and praying for the good of the future church and society as a whole. I thank you.